So in the 2010s, a big topic of discussion was gentrification in Brooklyn. Now, gentrification did involve some immigrants, people moving from other countries to Brooklyn, but it mostly involved other Americans from other parts of the country who were moving into Brooklyn. But there was also the continued phenomenon of immigrants making Brooklyn a home and immigrants continuing to live in Brooklyn throughout this time period. So I'm looking at a map and it makes you think, while gentrification got so much attention in Brooklyn as a new phenomenon, really when you look at a lot of the neighborhoods in Brooklyn, still many, many immigrants. And I'm not sure how many continued to arrive in Brooklyn during the 2010s, but certainly many who arrived in the 90s and 2000s continued to live there and to make up a big portion of the population. So you look at neighborhoods like Canarsie, East Flatbush, Flatbush, Flatlands. These are vast portions of the borough, and I know from my experience, I don't know if immigrants formed the majority of those neighborhoods, but they certainly were a large part of it. And I would say in those places, it was a lot of Caribbean immigrants, people from Jamaica, from Trinidad, Barbados, a very large part of the population. This is evident in storefronts, restaurants, different shops, places that sold special, like imported specialty ingredients and foods. Very obvious, very big presence, and really not a large presence of gentrification in those places. I'd say none in Canarsie and Flatlands, maybe some in Flatbush and East Flatbush, but pretty much none when you get to like southern Brooklyn, for example. Sheepshead Bay, Brighton Beach, Manhattan Beach, I would say very, very large Russian immigrant population. It's same thing. There's like, I would say very little to none gentrification in these places, being Americans moving into Brooklyn, as I mentioned before, from like professionals or artists, things like that. Sheepshead Bay, Brighton Beach, a lot of Russian restaurants, storefronts, the same thing, same phenomenon that you'd see in a place like East Flatbush, where these immigrant communities make a home for themselves, at least temporarily. And then moving west in South Brooklyn, former Italian stronghold of Bensonhurst, actually a lot of Russian and Chinese immigrants over there. So you have a place which was known for Italians and still is to some extent, but a lot of Chinese and Russian immigrants I noticed over there, and the Italian presence is kind of declined as far as visibility. You'll still see certain Italian stores and social clubs, for example, but I would say for the most part, driving through Bensonhurst, you would not know it's famous for being an Italian neighborhood. Now, I know when I worked there, I would, and meeting clients in people's homes, I know that there still were Italian families which continued to hold on to properties through the generations. But overall, it did not feel so much, at least driving through it during the daytime and what you're seeing of the stores and shops on the avenues, it didn't really feel like an Italian neighborhood anymore. A very large Chinese presence. And Bay Ridge, moving west, for example, also used to be well known as an Italian neighborhood. If you've ever seen the movie Saturday Night Fever, that's what it's shown as. That was a movie from the late 1970s, and Bay Ridge is shown as it had a very large Italian presence, and like Bensonhurst, I think it still does to some extent. But going along the avenues there's now or in the 2010s, I would notice very, very large Arab population. A lot of stores selling Arab clothes and foods, things of that nature. So Bay Ridge, very large immigrant population as well. These are, I would say, at least half of South Brooklyn has a very large immigrant population. And these are not people who got here, I would say 40 years ago. These are people who arrived as not in the 1990s, 2000s. That would be what I would think anecdotally. And then even moving north, Sunset Park, also, I would say, if not most of the people there, at least a very, very large Chinese and Mexican immigrant population there. Actually, Sunset Park is known as Brooklyn's Chinatown. And you driving through there, I could definitely see why. Now, you do see there's also some of the influx of Americans, as I would see throughout that decade. Many of them started to settle there too, get apartments, set up shop in Sunset Park. So moving to North Brooklyn, this is where you start to see the more recent phenomenons of Brooklyn, the phenomenon that we're getting attention for the most part. Because the immigrant phenomenon has been going on in Brooklyn for probably well over 100 years at this point. So it's really nothing new. But the thing that I find striking about it is why it would continue throughout this decade in such large numbers. Because Brooklyn is so congested and so difficult to get apartments and pay rent. And a lot of these immigrants had families, had kids. And these families would have to deal with the small amount of space. And I worked for many of these families, and these apartments, really, people raising whole families in them with kids and their toys and the family's possessions, and sometimes there's grandparents, and they have to deal with small apartments. But from what I was told by people, it probably just has a lot to do with the networks that have been set up, the immigrant networks that have been set up over the generations. So even with all the downsides to living in Brooklyn during that time, there was still the upsides in that from a lot of different countries, someone could arrive and get linked up with other people from their home country and be able to get going in America with with working and finding out how things are done, some kind of support network. So that never died out. That continued throughout the decade, I would say. You could arrive and maybe you already have relatives here, or your relatives know somebody here, something like that, and there would be some kind of support. And then possibly people would go somewhere else in the country that had lower costs of living and more space in terms of backyard or a house or something like that. But Brooklyn continued to be a lucrative place in some ways. Well, maybe not lucrative is the word, but an effective place to set up shop in America. So, as I mentioned, South Brooklyn, just not as much changes to the way things have been done over there, but even in North Brooklyn, still you have moving into like Crown Heights from Flatbush, also very large Jamaican Caribbean population in Crown Heights. Bushwick, as I mentioned in other videos, a lot of Spanish, Hispanic people. Same even today in Williamsburg, famous for changing so much in the decade. And even in these other places, Park Slope, Gowanus, you will find plenty of immigrants even in those places as well. Greenpoint, once known as the Polish neighborhood of, if not Brooklyn, but New York. The Polish presence, I would say, declined a lot, but still, it was not unusual to walk down Manhattan Avenue and other parts of Greenpoint and still hear Polish spoken. So that's something I wanted to talk about and acknowledge. I think it was fascinating to see these people arrive often with not much with them from various countries and still setting up shop in Brooklyn and keeping this phenomenon going through a time of very, very high cost of living. So that's it for today. And we'll have other topics to talk about.